And good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. And welcome to another in our Arrive webinar series. We are deeply excited for the first of three sessions that we will have with the authors of the groundbreaking book, Sexual Citizens. I'm Joe Storch. I use he and him. I am an associate counsel in the SUNY Office of General Counsel and oversee a number of projects that look at response to and prevention of sexual and interpersonal violence here at the State University of New York. We have a professional closed captioner on, and you can access that through the tools at the bottom of Zoom. We are grateful to the Student Conduct Institute for providing that for all of our members. We want to make sure that you are aware of, or for all of our attendees today, we want to make sure that you are aware of our two upcoming sessions talking about campus geography in June and talking about the overlap with ODEI coming this September, as well as a session that we're going to do during the Spectrum Conference at the end of June. We are so excited to welcome our speakers alongside my great colleague, Elizabeth Brady. And first, before we do, to give us some opening remarks, I wanted to invite Margie Fisher, who is the Title IX coordinator at Columbia University, a great friend of the work that we do, and someone who was so kind to get this whole project started and get us all introduced, a former prosecutor and a well-regarded Title IX attorney and teacher. Margie, please offer some opening remarks.
Thank you so much. I call Joe my Title IX whisperer. And so thank you so much for being here and for being incredibly knowledgeable and industrious. You just tell Joe, I think we should do X, and X is done, and 3 parts. So thank you all. Welcome to today's program, From Compliance to Transformation, Sexual Citizens in the Future of Campus Sexual Assault Prevention. As Joe said, I'm the Title IX coordinator at Columbia University and have been for about 5 years. And when I first got here, I had the good fortune to meet Jennifer Hirsch and Shamus Khan. They gave me a grizzled sex crimes prosecutor for 30 years, and at the time, a mother of 2 sons and a daughter, right smack in the middle of college and grad school, and new to higher ed, which you can imagine this was a confluence of alarm with respect to the notion of sexual assault on campus, as you can imagine. But they gave me a new way to understand campus sexual assault and the notion of prevention. And their stories from their students, which was a massive undertaking, educated me. Jennifer and Shamus are the authors of Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of power, sex, power, and assault on campus. And they are here today to discuss their book and its implications for college campuses in the prevention space. Their book was named one of NPR's best books of 2020. And I'd just like to quote the editor from All Things Considered, one of my favorite shows. Over 5 years, professors Jennifer Hirsch and Shamus Khan interviewed more than 150 Columbia and Barnard College undergrads about their sex lives. The research explored what students wanted out of sex, how troubling encounters unfolded, and how layers of misunderstandings led to assault. This is the book to read to help lead conversations about sex. It reframes the dialogue. It helps prepare young people for sexual relationships. Read it, share it, embody the young folks in your life. And I have taken that to heart, both in my life as a mom and in my life as a Title IX coordinator. Jennifer and Shamus shared with me the results of this comprehensive study on campus sexual assault, SHIFT, the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, consisting of these interviews, eliciting young people's broad accounts of their lives and how sex fits into it, and surveying thousands of students on our campus about their experiences with sex and sexual assault. And from that day on, I saw these cases through a different lens. It's not just numbers and percentages, as so many studies trumpet, shocking us, but giving us no direct solutions. The campus doesn't have to be a hunting ground. Danger is not ever present. By understanding powerful concepts of sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies, I and we learn a new language for understanding the forces that shape young people's sexual relationships. The result transformed my understanding of these cases and provided a new roadmap for how to address it. We just did a program at Columbia for our coaches where Jennifer and Shamus talked about these concepts in the athletic space. The coaches were incredibly engaged. They sought new ways to make conversations about these issues safe and teachable moments before incidents happen that could vault their players into accusations and investigations. They understood their critical role in finding the time and the place for students who come to the university with various levels of sexual experience to ask questions and grow into their sexual citizenship. Their groundbreaking research led to changes on my campus, Columbia's campus, around sexual geography, finally giving places for students to go and to grow, other than a tiny dorm room containing not much more than 2 beds. Their work is incredible, and I welcome you all to our program today and to the next 2. Jennifer is a professor of socio-medical sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia. Her research spans 5 intertwined domains: the anthropology of love, gender, sexuality, and migration, sexual reproductive and HIV risk practices, social scientific research on sexual assault, and undergraduate well-being, and the intersection between anthropology and public health. She is one of New York City's 16 heroes in the fight against gender-based violence. In 2012, she was selected as a Guggenheim Fellow. Shamus is a professor of sociology and American studies at Princeton University, formerly at Columbia, and he is the author of dozens of books and articles on inequality, American culture, gender, and elites. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, CNN, and many other media outlets. In 2018, he was awarded the Hans L. Zetterberg Prize for the Best Sociologist Under 40. Thank you so much for being here, all of you, and thank you, Jennifer and Shamus, and Joe and Elizabeth, for teaching me so much.
Thank you, Margie. We so appreciate that. Before we begin, we do want to acknowledge that some of the content discussed here may be difficult and is of a sexual nature. We encourage you, if you need to turn your camera off, or if you need to take a moment to be able to do so. We will also reference the RAIN hotline, 800-656-4673. And for anyone in the state of New York, of course, there is the SAVER, the Sexual Assault and Violence Response Resource, available at response.suny.edu. We do invite you, if you are able and if you are comfortable, to turn your camera on. You will note that there are no PowerPoint slides being displayed. And I hope you celebrate that as much as we do. We do love seeing the feedback, the facial feedback we get in this more conversation fireside chat. And so without further ado, I will turn things over to my great colleague, our Director of Sexual and Interpersonal Violence Prevention at the State University of New York, Elizabeth Brady. Elizabeth?
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Brady. I use she, her pronouns. And before we begin with the first question, I just wanted to take a moment to express my excitement and my gratitude for, I think, something that our field has been a little bit starved for a long time. This book not only calls for us to go beyond just adjudication and responding to violence, while we do remain committed to reducing barriers for students to report. There was one line in particular from the book that stood out to me in terms of addressing an entirely different group of students, where the quote was, "I just don't have time to deal with the reporting process," which goes to show that there are some students who we may never be able to get to report, but that doesn't mean that those students aren't equally deserving of an opportunity to thrive in college and in their university experience. And at the same time, that we shouldn't go far beyond that and take a comprehensive public health approach to our prevention efforts. So I'm very, very excited today, and I'm going to give it back to Joe to ask our first question.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Shamus, Jennifer, the shift study was different. Margie gave a little bit of an introduction to it. We at the State University of New York, of course, have a very large data set in our climate survey, and many institutions and the federal government have collected quantitative data. But you got to go beyond just big number pools into qualitative data. And what you found was something that is harder to tease out of those big number pools. You conducted focus groups, interviews, and your researchers were in the residence halls, at the parties, at the fraternity houses, and the like. Could you talk about some of the benefits and new insights gained in applying the qualitative lens to this work?
Sure. So first, thank you, Joe, Elizabeth. Thank you, Margie, for that lovely introduction. Shamus and I always wish our parents were here to hear those. So I'm going to open with a story, which I think will illustrate some of the value of the kinds of data that we collected. When we interviewed him, Austin, it was later in his time in college, and he was a very engaging interview subject. The scene in the book with Austin and his girlfriend on a hot summer night, that's the only really kind of spicy sex scene in the book. Not going to describe it here. But he was doing his part to narrow the campus orgasm gap. So, he and his girlfriend actually had nicknames for the kinds of orgasms that she would have. So he was committed not just to being a good lover, but like to being a good boyfriend, a good human. And we asked all the students when we interviewed them about their best and worst sexual experiences on campus before we asked them about assault. And he said, well, this was something weird that happened. And then he described being shuffled off into someone else's room during early in the freshman year so that his roommate could be alone with his roommate's girlfriend. And when he got into that room, there was a girl there. She was in her bed, kind of drunk. And she said, the first thing she said was, I don't want to do anything. And that's weird that you have to establish a sexual boundary with someone who comes into your room who you barely know. And he didn't respect it. He got in bed with her and started to touch her body. And then he stopped himself. And so we went on in the course of the interview, we also asked him, well, do you know what a sexual assault is? And he could define it. I mean, the Columbian Barnard students, nothing if not very good at capturing information and regurgitating it. And so he said it's anything non-consensual, sexual, anything. And then he paused and his eyes welled up with tears and he said, you'll excuse me, fuck me. He was just wrecked. He could not believe, given who he had become, that was something that he had done. When we started the SHIFT research project in 2014, the circulating conversation around campus sexual assault, as I'm sure many of you know, was focused on what Marjorie alluded to, the hunting ground, on sort of the inevitability of bad people on campus doing harmful things, how to find them and adjudicate better so that they're not on campus. And in the research that Shamus and I present in Sexual Citizens, we have an entirely different project, which is to expand the conversation, thinking about that story that I told about Austin. How could we keep stories like that from happening? And so through the immersive research, which takes sort of a deep dive into students' daily lives, not just sexual assault, but sex and socializing and social inequality, we were able to give a sense of how sexual assault is engineered into the fabric of daily life on campus, which sounds a little bit like a despair-inducing framework, except that once you see how it's engineered in, we can start to have a very different kind of conversation about what it means to engineer it out. And I think particularly, and I know that we'll get to this later in the conversation, but the participant observation that we did helped us see the role that space plays in producing vulnerability to sexual assault. And since part of the power of public health is creating spaces in which people can thrive, where they're more likely to do well, less likely to hurt themselves or others, one of our big arguments in Sexual Citizens is that an expanded approach to prevention involves taking that spatial context into account.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because that sort of leads us into our next question, which is about how the book is centered around three big ideas: sexual citizenship, sexual projects, and sexual geographies. These are through the lens which you make sense of sexual assault. Can you share how these ideas interact with one another?
Absolutely. So just reiterating Jennifer's thanks. And I'm also tell a story, and this will kind of bring you into the book and give you a sense of, to also sort of build on the answer to the first question. Charisma described Columbia as a white institution. And what she meant by that, in her words, were it was filled with guys who drank too much, listened to shitty music, couldn't dance, and didn't find her attractive. And so in her experience of campus life, to find partners that she found more attractive, clearly, and that she thought would be more interested in her, she ended up meeting a guy through her roommate, and they texted back and forth for a couple weeks, and then she decided to go out and meet him. He lived in Brooklyn. She was from living on campus. And for those of you who kind of know New York, getting from Morningside Heights to Brooklyn, it can be a trek on a weekend when the trains aren't running well, et cetera. And it was one of those weekends. So it took her like an hour and a half to get out there. She was soaking wet. She got caught in the rain. And she got to his place and, peeled off some of her clothes. They smoked a joint, had a beer, and, were making out. Everything was fine. And then he started to put his hands on her body in places where she didn't want them. She moved his hands away and he put them right back. Charisma then described to us having sex with him, even though in one of the encounters, she also described saying no. And she reasoned that he must have thought she was uncomfortable because he repositioned them. She didn't think about this as an assault, even though she'd been clear in moving his hand away and in saying no, that she didn't really desire that kind of sexual contact. Now, when you listen to this story, one hot take could be like, what a terrible guy that guy is. And we should find him and punish him. And, that man did something wrong. Whether or not he's a terrible person, I think is another question. But he certainly did something wrong, and he did something that was harmful. The other question we would ask is like whether or not just punishing him would have transformed that situation. And the concepts that you've identified in the book and that we sort of center the stories around, sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies, give us a kind of different lens. And they point to what Jennifer's talked about earlier, what's modifiable about the context that could actually make that sort of experience less likely to happen. So sexual projects is the answer to the question, what is sex for? And you might think only two academics could ask a question like, what is sex for? But as it turns out, sex is for lots of different things. And the things that people are trying to do with their sex lives influences the situations that they enter into and the situations that assaults come from. People have sex for lots of reasons, for pleasure, although not all sex is pleasurable, for status. We have this entire language of whether or not someone is in or out of your league in sex, a way to define ourselves. We saw this particularly among LGBTQIA students, that sex as a definitional project of identity was really important, a way to give comfort to a partner. So if we look at Charisma's story, there are two things about the sexual projects there that are really important to recognize. The first is that over Charisma's sort of career of her sexuality, she told us lots of sort of trial and error things of trying to figure out how sexuality was working. And that was really a failure of the communities that had raised her to give her clarity about what sex was for. The guy she was with was really clear about what sex was for. It was for him to have sexual pleasure. Sexual citizenship is the answer to the question, is the idea that people have the right to say yes and the right to say no to sex, and that they have an obligation to recognize the same rights in other people. In the story that we tell, there is a profound failure of sexual citizenship on the part of the man. He had a real clear sense of his right to say yes to sex, but he had no sense of Charisma's equivalent humanity. And that failure to recognize her fundamental equivalence was a significant problem and a significant reason why the sexual assault occurred. And so teaching sexual citizenship is something that we really strongly advocate for. Finally, sexual geographies is the idea that space matters. There are three parts of the space mattering to this story that I want to highlight. The first is that she was in his apartment, and who has control over the spaces where sex happens is really important, in part because it's deeply intertwined with power. And we find that space and power are two modifiable aspects of situations that are levers that we might be able to sort of work upon in order to prevent sexual assault. The second part of that power was that Charisma was not like other Columbia and Barnard students who could just turn on their phone, open up an app, and be whisked away in a car to get back to campus when she was uncomfortable. It's a $60 car ride. She didn't have $60. And so, the intersection of being in his space and being far away from where she lived was also very consequential. This gets back to the third point. I opened the story not to say that she described Columbia as a white space, not for like effect, but because literally in Charisma's experience, that space was a space dominated by whiteness and masculinity. And it drove her away from campus. The idea isn't that like Brooklyn is a dangerous place. It's instead that the kinds of protections that so many other students enjoy, being surrounded by friends, being in places where they feel comfortable, being close to their own rooms, were something that wasn't really available to Charisma. And part of the reason for that was because the space of campus was organized around particular drinking practices, around having certain people having access to and control over space that weren't people like Charisma. That also then becomes a modifiable aspect of campus life that we might be able to work upon in order to transform people's experiences, not only of sexual assault, but also of just sex and sociality more generally on campus.
You brought up power dynamics, and I want to talk about that a little bit more, especially as it relates to identity. Can you speak to what you were able to reveal about the way that race, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and other social identities can influence the likelihood of sexual assault, and how youth with marginalized identities may experience power and sexual citizenship differently?
Yeah, so I would say the first point about power, most of the decades of work on campus sexual assault has looked at gender as sort of the fundamental form of power that produces campus sexual assault. And that's not wrong. It does play an important role. But our argument takes what I think most people will understand now to be an intersectional approach by showing that there are many other forms of power that are important for understanding campus sexual assault. For example, of the Black women with whom we spoke, every single one had experienced unwanted, non-consensual sexual touching. We always feel like that bears repeating, every single one. And so the work that campuses are doing to prevent sexual assault by teaching consent isn't going to get at preventing those assaults entirely, because they're also a manifestation of anti-Black racism. And so race is actually central to our analysis, and you can build on that by thinking about all of the other forms of social inequality that exist on campus. And for most students, campuses are the most diverse institution they'll ever be a part of. And so whether it's wealth or just any of the forms of social inequality, they're all there in the mix, meaning that some students have more power than others. Shamus and I are fond of driving metaphors. And, if you think about sharing the road, and one car is a Hummer and another car is a Mini Cooper, if the Hummer hits the Mini Cooper, it's going to knock it off the road, right? And so there are structural reasons. There are people on campus who are like those Hummers, and it's not just gender. Compounding that is the idea of power as situational. So there's some forms of power that have to do not with qualities that are inherent to people, but that have to do with sort of where they are in the moment. So if you think, for example, of a senior in a fraternity house with a first-year student who's a senior man in a fraternity house surrounded by his friends with a first-year student who's a woman. Yes, he's a man and she's a woman, and we'll get into less cis-hetero examples in a minute, but he's also 3 years older than she is. He likely has more sexual experience. He has more drinking experience. He's surrounded by people who will support him. and he knows how people act on campus, whereas sort of the prime directive, particularly in the beginning of freshman year, is just to not do anything stupid. And so all of those forms of power combine to create a situation in which it's very it's very possible that that people can hurt other people without meaning to. And we're not meaning to distract from the question of individual responsibility. We tell a book in the story of Lucy and Scott, that sort of fits into that paradigm, and that is sort of the archetypical paradigm. The point is not that that we shouldn't hold Scott in some way responsible for what he did, but rather that it's entirely possible to look at that situation and see that we also bear some responsibility for producing it. And an example of that is like the reason in the book that Lucy is in Scott's room, one of the reasons is because freshmen aren't allowed to drink and have parties in their dorms. And so the sexual geography of campus funnels students into spaces that are controlled by older students. So that is part of the sort of assaultogenic environment on campus. And then the third point about power is that you don't necessarily have to have power to use power. So in the book, we tell the story of Maddie, who was assigned male at birth and transitioning to live in her identity as a woman. And she felt really super supported by her girlfriend and lucky to be in an ongoing relationship. There was just one problem. Her girlfriend really wanted to have sex with Maddie's penis, and Maddie didn't want to have penis in the vagina sex because it felt like an erasure of her womanhood. And her girlfriend went on, and as Maddie said, her wants overtook my needs. And Maddie was assaulted. And so you might not think of the girlfriend of a genderqueer or transitioning student as like a super powerful person on campus, but there were two forms of power at work there. There's the interpersonal power that Maddie's girlfriend wielded by saying to her, "You don't think I'm beautiful," which like pierced Maddie to the core because she knew what that felt like. But then there's the social exclusion that trans students have to endure over the course of their lives in so many places. And so if Maddie and her girlfriend hadn't grown up in a climate where they typically didn't have a lot of people to rely on, then Maddie might have felt that it was easier to walk away from that relationship, that she might have felt easier to say, the thing that you're asking me to do, I don't want to do that, and I can't be in this relationship anymore. Or just, I don't want to do that. So it's important, the take home from all this is that it's important to complicate our analyses of power, because if you don't think about power in a sufficiently nuanced way, then you're going to end up with a sort of one size fits all approach to prevention, which is too simplistic.
It was one of the things that I found so interesting was getting away from some of the archetypal stories that are told about sexual assault on campus and helping us remember that these are not, they are giant populations, but they're also made up of a lot of individuals who have a lot of things going on and bring a lot of identities to the table and bring a lot of past experiences. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But let's shift a bit to talk about consent. In some ways, as folks who have worked a lot on the definitions of consent and the law around it, it's good to know that the students reported understanding the legal definitions of consent at maybe a higher level than maybe we would have expected. New York, like a number of other states, actually has state legislation that requires a uniform definition of consent across our public and private colleges. But their actions, even as they identified to you an understanding of consent, they listened at orientation and the trainings, didn't exactly match that. Some of them thought that consent could be expressed in 4 characters, you up, and others thought consent had a spatial element to it. When you're in someone else's room, you're maybe on their turf. When you're in your room, you maybe have a bit more control. And some of of these uncommunicative or less communicative elements of consent in practice. So there's in the book, and then there's in the field, as they would say. Geographies clearly play a role in this. Education clearly plays a role in this. But tell us about what you found. I think this is something we want to spend a bit of time on. And when you, well, let's start with tell us what you found, and then I have a follow-up about sex education and education that folks might get before they go to college. But let's start with talking about consent as you saw it in the field.
So when running the focus groups were, about 2 hours long, and we did it with 17 different kinds of groups of students. And one of the things I did in every focus group was to ask students, like, how would I meet somebody if I wanted to, say, meet up with someone on a Saturday night? And the students would be like, well, you would go and pre-party a little bit with your friends. You sort of get your squad together, and they'd function as your wingman or wingwomen. You'd have drinks with them. Then you'd go out. You'd have a party you kind of had an idea that you wanted to go to, where people you were kind of interested in would be. So, like, if I was a queer student, I probably wouldn't go to a frat party, but I might go to some group that's like throwing an event, like the theater, a theater troupe might be throwing an event that weekend. And I'd get to that party, the music would be blasting, I'd make eye contact with someone, might start dancing with them, touch their body, and so and so. And so this was sort of the story they told me. And then later, like an hour later in the conversation, I'd said to the students, like, so talk to me about what consent is. Like, what makes affirmative consent? They'd say, oh, well, you definitely have to talk to the person, and you've got to be sober, and, dot, dot, dot. And so then I sort of paused and I said, like, wait, when I asked you an hour ago about how to meet somebody, you told me to get drunk and go to a space where I couldn't hear anything, and I danced with someone and started to touch them. And now you just told me that affirmative consent was something totally different than that. How do those two things go together? And they all kind of like sort of laughed and said, well, the practicality of people's intimate and sexual lives is very different than their kind of reality. Some of them were a little distraught to learn this because they'd really kind of learned a lot of lessons about consent. They felt like they'd internalized them, and they realized that the organization of meeting people was very different than the practices that they'd learned about affirmative consent. Now, on this, I want to make a couple points. The first is that, like, affirmative consent is very important, but it's not enough. So our argument in the book is not that affirmative consent is a problem, it's that it's insufficient. And if we stop at consent, we don't actually do everything we need to do. To return to the driving metaphor that Jennifer introduced earlier about the Hummer, think for a moment if I taught you how to drive and I was like, you only need to know two things for driving: how to stop at stop signs and how to stop at red lights. Like, would you be a very good driver? Like, absolutely not, you wouldn't be. You could, like, be driving on the wrong side of the road. You may not know how to yield. Like, you would enter into roundabouts and maybe just like plow through people. So there's so much more than just knowing those things in order to be a kind of successful person and navigating intimate encounters. And one of the challenges is that we have, and this I think will move into your questions about sex ed, a profound commitment to young people's sexual ignorance. And that profound commitment to young people's sexual ignorance means that, like, we bring them onto campuses and we teach them about affirmative consent, which, as we argue in the book, is sort of like teaching people about calculus when you haven't taught them arithmetic, right? There's so much of a foundation that's missing from beyond that point. The second thing I'll say is that, like, many of our lessons to young people are conceptual. They're not practical. And that people learn in many different ways. And we need to both have a conceptual and practical foundation for our knowledge. That is, it needs to be grounded in what we know and what we know how to enact, and that we practice enacting. And that tends to be one of the challenges, is that, like, they conceptually know the ideas, but they're not actually related to their everyday practices. I'll say one last thing and then I'll stop prattling on. The other challenge is that, like, students have a lot of consensual sex. In fact, most of their consensual sex without practicing affirmative consent. So the bright boundary between affirmative consent and, say, assault isn't as bright for students because most of their sexual experiences are consensual and most of their sexual experiences do not involve affirmative consent. And so that also is a major barrier for them to sort of connect the dots, because if non-affirmative consent sex is assault, they have tons of experiences of non-affirmative consent sex that was pleasurable for both parties, or maybe not pleasurable, but at least agreed upon by both parties.
So you make a great point about a commitment to profound ignorance. I really like that line. So I took driver's education in my high school. It was offered by my high school. I think I had to pay a $3 fee or some kind of thing like that. And I also took health education in my high school, which was taught. I referred to my teacher, as so many American high school students do, as coach, which was the appropriate appellation because his main job was as coach of a semi-successful football team that we had. And as we discussed a few weeks ago when we were all chatting, he was not very comfortable talking about sex education. So we spent the time learning about legumes, which is really literally the only time I've ever used that phrase. Other people call them beans, and apparently they have great health attributes, and that's great. But maybe not as useful as elements of consent and respect, whether it's affirmative consent or anything about sex, which might be mysterious to some young people. Young people fill that gap from their high schools with stories and rumors and whispers and pornography. Talk a little bit about this. I know this is something you're passionate about. We often say that by the time they get to freshman orientation, it's quite a bit late to start this conversation. Let's dive deep into that.
Yeah, I mean, we asked all the students that we spoke with about the sex education that they had had. Nobody brought up legumes. Sorry, but most of them laughed and said, "Oh, you mean my sexual diseases class?" Because if they had gotten sex ed, mostly it sought to convince them that sex was a dirty, rotten, dangerous, nasty thing that they should only do with someone they love after they're married, which doesn't set, most people in America do have sex before they get married. It doesn't set people up very well for an emergence into sexual adulthood to convey to them that they shouldn't be having sex. For queer youth, it was even worse because so much sex ed is really heteronormative. And so the message wasn't just that they should have sex later. It was that the sex they wanted to have didn't exist and that therefore they didn't exist. So it was just part of the school context of social exclusion that they experienced. We also found in the SHIFT study, and this is the broader study, which included, in addition to the ethnography, included survey research, in an analysis of the survey led by my husband, John Santelli, always got to give John a shout out, that they found that women who'd had comprehensive sex education before starting college, that included actually practicing saying no to sex they didn't want to have, which is not abstinence-only sex education. It's just sex education that includes a skills development component. Those women were half as likely to be raped in college. That is a really big effect size. That was, imagine a year ago when everything was shut down. We were hoping for a vaccine. We were hoping for a vaccine that was 50% effective. So essentially, there already is a vaccine for sexual assault that is 50% effective, and states, including New York State, are just choosing not to make sure that everyone gets it. New York is one of the states that doesn't mandate comprehensive, age-appropriate K through 12 sex education in schools. I'm part of the statewide group that's trying to change that. I'll drop the sign up in the chat if you want to join me. Because sexual assault is not one thing, it's many things. Comprehensive sex ed is not going to prevent all assaults, but it can teach people about healthy relationships and, importantly, we think it can actually teach people not to assault people, which is really, that should be our goal, right? Like, yes, it's good for people to be able to forcefully communicate when they don't want to have sex with someone, but really it's our goal to teach people not to rape, and we're not doing a very good job with that. And comprehensive sex ed is a big under-leveraged tool. It's also, I mean, like a big message in Sexual Citizens is that our, I would say, resounding failure over the decades to move the needle on campus sexual assault is because it's been regarded as a campus problem, right? Like, you all on campus have to fix this thing, or you're tasked with fixing this thing, but it's an everyone problem. And so expanding out and thinking about comprehensive sex ed is one way of arguing not just that this is a policy that could really have an impact, but that we're not going to effectively respond to campus sexual assault if we just lay more stuff on campuses to do. We need more hands on deck.
I really was excited to hear that analogy in the book, and especially when thinking about it through the context of recognizing that there's not one type of sexual assault, and speaking about sexual assault as a conceptual thing makes it really, really easy to turn it into one really specific thing and make it harder to apply skills in sexual activity for folks. And one of the things that made me think about was that in prevention practices, a lot of the times we'll do sort of interactive scenarios with students, or we'll have conversations about hypotheticals. And something that I've done, up until reading the book and thought was a very much so inclusive practice and was definitely really well intentioned, was I would make names and scenarios entirely gender neutral. And you brought up in your book that this actually creates a real missed opportunity to discuss, gendered scripts and the intersections of gender identity and sexual assault or sexual orientation and sexual violence. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that, maybe some suggestions or implications for folks who are doing this work on college campuses, or even reflect a little bit more on that statement that you had made.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we sometimes point to the T video in this conversation, and many of you may be familiar with the T video. And the T video is great, right? It's a good video that talks to people about consent. And it's, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's a video that says, like, if you've made tea and someone says they don't want tea anymore, don't force them to drink the tea. And like, if someone is passed out, don't pour tea down their throat. Like, it's kind of this cute Britishy sort of thing. Actually, I don't think it's British, but the tea aspect of it makes me feel like it is. And the one thing that Jennifer and I note about the tea video is that it is stick figures, and there's a reason why it's stick figures, right? Like, you want to. Jennifer said just earlier that so much of sex ed is queer exclusive, that for LGBTQIA folk, they're often left out of sex ed because of the presumption of heterosexuality. So if we think for a moment about so much sex ed that talks about pregnancy, well, the risks of pregnancy, even thinking about pregnancy as a risk, conveys something about sex, and it also conveys something about who are the typical people who have sex with one another, or who are the normal people that have sex with one another. And so, those stick figures or inclusive names provide you with a lot of flexibility in terms of not having to worry about, an exclusionary sex ed. And so the impulse is super valuable. And I would say that, like, in many instances, it's not something we should throw away, but we also need to layer onto it a recognition that people don't have sex in degendered bodies. They don't have sex in deracialized bodies. And the kinds of things that Jennifer and I are sort of pointing to is that if we take seriously the idea that sexual assault emerges because, in part, of power asymmetries, that gender and power is an important part of those power asymmetries, but that gender is intersectional, and that there are many other forms of power that are important, that part of what sex ed needs to do is not just educate people in sex, it also needs to educate people in power, and how it is that power can lead them to act in ways or to do things to others that those others may not want, where they feel like they can't actually raise their voice. And so power can be silencing of other people, and that can lead to assault, as well as recognizing how power in different situations can put you at risk of being assaulted. And that acknowledgement of power requires that we situate people's sexual experiences in actual bodies. And it's not that like a heterosexual example that highlights dynamics of power never speaks to queer people. In some instances, it's even easier to see things in contexts that you're not embedded in. And so what we're partially calling for is a discussion of sex that places power at the center of it as part of sex ed, and that recognizes the intersectional character of power and how that intersectional character of power requires examples that highlight those sets of things, and that people are given an education in power and how power can help them harm and can put them at risk of being harmed. And that's sort of what we're kind of pushing for with that vision of like, you know, maybe it's the stick figures and, or, you know, the degendered language, but then also a conversation of gender, and bringing all kinds of social dynamics into play in the education that we're providing these people.
And we're looking forward to diving deeper into those in our third session, as well as in a session at the Spectrum Conference, because certainly the research that you brought to the table, it's a conversation that's been having for a while, but it's nice to have real data and real information to support it. We want to shift gears again and talk about alcohol. And alcohol is a very difficult topic to talk about in sexual assault prevention. In prevention work, many folks shy away from any discussion of alcohol to avoid an accusation that it's victim blaming, that we're saying, oh, well, if you, the person who is coming forward and disclosing assault or violence, if only you weren't drinking, this wouldn't have happened to you. And there is a big concern about having teaching that message and showing that message and putting the impetus on only certain people to avoid sexual assault. But we cannot deny that alcohol is in use across higher education. We read in the book a lot about the role of alcohol in these incidents in a very different light. Access, power, organization of social spaces, and who has the social spaces in which alcohol can be served, and what dynamics that leads to, who has social spaces in which alcohol cannot be served, how folks might find themselves alone in a situation where alcohol is being served, but there is a sense of belonging in wanting to be there. You talk about the power to procure alcohol and controlling the spaces where it is hosted. And you also talk about alcohol in terms of reducing, not on the victim's side, but on the offender side. Maybe, perhaps, there are people who would not have taken harmful actions when they were sober or not using alcohol or other substances, that perhaps take those actions. And this is an incredibly difficult thing, but what comes forth in the book is that it's something that has to be talked about. Let's talk about just that.
Let's talk about it. So I would say one of the central arguments that we make in the book is about alcohol in relation to the power of whiteness. And I mean, Shamus and I didn't set out to write a book about race, but it's threaded through the analysis in all kinds of ways. And the chapter about the social organization of campus drinking explains how campus policies and campus traditions have come together so that alcohol is in many instances controlled by older students who are white and heterosexual and wealthy and men. And so there's many implications of that. One is that the practice that they see as a super fun way to spend their time becomes defined as being college in a way that creates pressure for other students who might have different backgrounds to fall in line. We still know that white students and men drink more. So essentially, like, we have to move away from thinking about the thing that white men want to do as the thing that all college students want to do. But because those same white men control a disproportionate amount of desirable campus social space, and because it's very hard for younger students, they don't have access to space and they have less access to alcohol, and they're more heavily policed because they're under the drinking age. So there are all sorts of policies that come together to mean that alcohol is disproportionately available to students, particularly students who aren't super wealthy, in spaces controlled by those men who are powerful across so many dimensions. So that organizes a system that funnels vulnerable students into spaces that they don't control, where if you want to drink something other than shitty beer, you have to suck up to some older guy. And so we explain it not in relation to drinking behavior of individuals, but rather how drinking is socially organized, and then pointing to some of the policies behind that. We also, as you said, Joe, argue that not just because we don't want to get into victim blaming, but again, because like really our goal should be to teach people not to assault other people. And when students drink, it's important for them to understand that disinhibition, which can sometimes lead to like punching in a wall or destroying furniture, can also lead to them hurting other people. Setting aside if they're bad people or not bad people, but that disinhibition leads them to do stupid, harmful things. And so to help them be aware in the same way that, like, we don't want our kids to drive drunk, right? Because it is something that you could hurt somebody, you could die when you drive drunk. And similarly, like, drunk sex carries dangers for the person who's drinking. But we also need to step back, and in the book, I think that the deep dive methods of really hearing student stories and spending time with them as they socialize helped us see that another way into this conversation is thinking about why students drink. And here we get back to the question of sexual citizenship, because that deeply held commitment to sexual ignorance creates a lot of sexual shame for young people. And drinking is part of the way that they manage that shame. So, one young woman said to us that when she got drunk before hooking up, it was like Novocaine before going to the dentist. And, our hearts shattered into a million tiny pieces when we heard that. And, we did that, right? Her society, the people who conveyed to her that she shouldn't be having sex, combined with the pressure that she felt to have sex with somebody that she barely knew, which just, like, honestly can be a kind of an awkward situation. So she wanted to have sex, but she didn't know how to have it in any other way. Students also drink to relieve stress. And so I think this is where you see you can't extricate the conversation about drinking from not just conversations about sexual shame, but also conversations about campus mental health. And then one final point that we always think it's super important to make is that certainly there are assaults that are associated with alcohol. And yet our survey, as other surveys have found, showed that there are also assaults that are not associated with alcohol. And what that means is that if we focus on reducing binge drinking as a way to reduce sexual assault, we're only reaching some students. And guess what? Those students are more likely to be white. So in the survey analyses, we found that white students were more likely to report an assault as significant when it was alcohol intoxicated. And students of color and queer students were more likely to report assaults as feeling significant to them when they were in the context of either intimate partner violence or unwanted non-consensual touching from a stranger. And so that focus on alcohol-associated assault is important, but it also centers whiteness in a way that can leave out prevention that would be directed towards more marginalized students.
Returning back to, oh, sorry, were you going to add
No,
something?
I was just going to say that was sort of a lot to chew on there, but.
I just returning back to the concept of sexual citizenship briefly before I want to spend a little bit more time on this. You talk a bit in the book, and we've touched on it here, denying the sexual citizenship of our young people. And there was one specific example that you talk about in the book where parents and folks know that children are having sex, but sort of operate under the not under my roof mentality. And reading that was really uncomfortable, but also made a lot of sense. With the understanding that we are a little bit away from getting to the space where parents are willing to have their child's partner over for both dinner and then welcome them for breakfast the next morning because they stayed over, understanding that may take a little bit of time. What are some of the things that college campuses can do and folks on college campuses who are interacting with students that they can do in their roles to help validate and recognize the sexual citizenship of students and young people who are coming onto campus?
I'll take one part of this and then I'll pass to Shamus. So I just want to push back a little bit at the idea that we are a little bit away from the sleepover. And we're referring here to Amy Shalet's incredible work comparing American and Dutch families. But I had my bluff called on the sleepover by my own children. And yeah, it was the most awkward cup of coffee I ever made. But if you are a parent and you want your child to have love and sex and intimacy and commitment all together in one package, the most powerful way that you can do that is to let them, right? Because that is a way that you convey to them, I see you as an emerging adult. There are other things parents can do too in terms of making sure their children have access to confidential, adequate sexual and reproductive health services. So I think we are not going to let families off the hook here, because they really need to step up and be partners in prevention. So that's the family part. But Shamus can pick up and talk more about campuses.
Sure. So, I think it's important to note that sexual citizenship as a concept is where Jennifer and I get moralistic about sex. And, we think that, in fact, there has been too much of a hesitancy to be moralistic about sex, and that's part of the challenge with addressing sexual assault. But let's be very clear, most of the moralism when it comes to discussions of sex is about sexual projects. That is it moral or not to hook up? Or is it moral or not to have same-sex desire? And that kind of moralism, we don't engage in at all, and some of it we're hostile to. But the morality that we bring into this story is how do you treat other people? The question of whether or not you recognize other people as people and you acknowledge and respect their fundamental human dignity. That is a question of morality that is absolutely essential to discussions of sex, but also just discussions of being a person in the world more generally. And what conversation are colleges best set up to have, but that conversation about what it means to be a good person in the world and to be a person in the world that is part of a kind of civic and collective enterprise. And, I think some of the challenges are, that so many of the discussions of that concept there's a huge firewall between them and conversations about sex. So the silences that we produce around sex and sexuality, part of the impact of those silences is that they create a barrier between conversations about moral personhood and sex and sexuality. We talk about sex and sexuality as if it's natural, right? It's just some natural thing. And whether or not it's fights over the naturalness of LGBTQIA people or the naturalness of sexual desire, particularly men's sexual desire, all of that. No, sex is actually a very social thing that is deeply embedded in our learnings about personhood. And personhood is partially clarity on our own rights to self-determination. So we ground sexual citizenship in the idea that people have the right to say yes and no to sex when they are fully formed humans. And that is a firm concept that Jennifer and I really sort of hold dear to. So there's a kind of individualistic component to it, but then also a moral obligation to connect the idea of your moral personhood to other people's moral personhood, that they also are the equivalent thing. And this is where, in some ways, and this will get to the third conversation that we have, like DEI work comes in, because recognizing other people as fundamentally morally equivalent beings becomes essential for everything that we would do. So now, let's get a little bit more practical. Like, what is it that universities can and should do? And part of my practicality is going to be frustrating to you, as Jennifer and I have said so many times, like, universities, they're not too late, but it's pretty late to have these conversations. And I think so much of the challenge that everyone on this call faces is that you are, in effect, getting people who are arriving on campus not having learned any arithmetic and being asked to teach them math, right? And like, how is that possible to teach people college math when they haven't learned to add? And that's actually what your challenge is. And so some of what we need to do is put pressure on, through our institutions, on broader institutions that we're a part of, to say, you are fundamentally underserving the people who are showing up on our campus. You need to do something about it. And it's pretty clear what you need to do. So one thing that can happen is that story. Another thing is to think about like how lots of things that we don't think of as sex ed are sex ed. And this applies, of course, to thinking about sex ed among very young people. So telling a young person, don't grab, use your words, is a sexual assault prevention strategy, right? Telling young people, you have the right to your own body and you don't have the right to touch other people's bodies if they don't want it, is a sexual assault prevention strategy. Well, one of the questions could become like, what are the sets of things that we can do to help develop a sense of moral personhood and moral obligation and recognition of other people's personhood as part of our education? And I think the critical thing is not to ask everyone on this call to do more, right? So like, you guys aren't doing enough. If you just did more, everything would be fine. It's partially to ask, how is it we can remove that firewall? Or how is it that we can build bridges between the lessons of everyday moral personhood and the lessons that people are getting in other contexts? The more sort of foundation points that we can build in that lesson of citizenship and tying it to the sexual part of our lives, the easier it becomes. Because when somebody has a conversation then in their literature class about the importance of respect and recognition, that conversation helps with sexual assault awareness and prevention. And so my suggestion would be, and we can get even more practical in this, is like, Jennifer and I are really big on thinking about how sexual assault prevention is everyone's job. That doesn't mean everyone teaches consent, because consent isn't the only part of sexual assault prevention that we need to do. It doesn't mean that everybody teaches sex ed. Like, there are lots of my colleagues I'd never want to teach sex ed. I don't even think I'd want to teach sex ed. Like, I'm not particularly like trained in it, right? So it probably shouldn't be my job either. But I teach a lot in my sociology classes that are about respect, recognition, and the languages of moral personhood, and a recognition of what it means to be a citizen in this country and in this world. And if those lessons can serve as foundational pillars for the broader lessons that people are, as part of a broader set of lessons that can serve to support the sex ed work that we're doing, then we can really have these kind of amplification effects that I think could be really beneficial.
As we come into the home stretch of what's been an incredible conversation, I actually want to stay on respect a little bit. And I want to surface some of the points that you open with the first couple pages and you really conclude with, which is that, yes, we know there are predators out there, and we'll deal with that separately. But we also know that there are people who commit certain acts because of a fundamental lack of respect for other people. And for some people, sex is very meaningless. And for other people, it's very meaningful. And some of the people for whom it's meaningless assume that everyone else treats it as meaningless, assume that everyone else treats it the way they do, and simply don't think about what other people want, what other people need. And in some ways, it's a conclusion that's so simple, right? It's so simple and so clear. And in other ways, it's so profound and meaningful that maybe some of this goes back to some core things that we teach in kindergarten, that we teach in second grade. Let's surface that a little bit and dive into some of what you found.
Yeah, I mean, and this goes back to the question of sexual projects. Shamus and I, as we have said, as researchers, are agnostic about whether there is a right sexual project. So, when we're speaking with college students, we're like, kids, live your best life. Now, as a mom, I'm not agnostic, but as researchers, we're like, there are some people who want to use other people as human scratching posts. And it doesn't actually matter what we think of that, because that's what they're trying to do. And so as long as they're clear with the other person that they're both having a sexual interaction where the only goal is each person's individual pleasure, who are we to judge, right? I think that the point, there's not a right sexual project morally, and there's also not necessarily a sexual project that keeps you safe from being assaulted. We tell the story of Adam, who grew up in the Midwest in a religious and conservative family, wasn't out to his parents, felt like he was going to be like a kid in a candy shop when he got to New York. In fact, that was not his experience, because it wasn't who he was to just meet guys on Grindr, have sex with them, and then they would ghost him. And so he was really his sexual project was monogamous intimacy. He loved his boyfriend. They were very close. He said the only problem is he's kind of forceful when he has sex, and then described being assaulted by him. He said, yeah, there was this one time that, he came home really drunk and he basically raped me. That was an assault. So in that situation, you see that it's not that intimacy is the safe sexual project and meaningless sex is the bad sexual project, but that different sexual projects carry their own risks. I think what we need to be doing on campus, sort of mapping our three ideas onto prevention. Young people need an opportunity to get clear about their sexual projects because they've been surrounded by sexual silence and shame. That's the individual level. So not just teaching about consent, but helping them think about what they want sex to be in their lives, which is an institutional recognition of their sexual citizenship, right? When you begin that conversation, the frame of that is, you're probably going to have sex. We're not judging you. You need a space to figure out what that's going to mean to you. The sexual citizenship is the interpersonal and collective level, right? What we all owe each other as people. And then really it's the sexual geographies that we want campuses to lean into, because we know that our power in public health is working in a multi-level way. So conveying information, helping people build skills, but also transforming the environment. This is not a problem that we can solve one penis at a time, as I've said before. And so we really need to, and not that penises are the only seat of sexual assault, but it's not a problem that we can solve one person at a time. And that means, as Shamus was saying, bringing other parts of the campus who haven't traditionally thought of themselves as sexual assault prevention stakeholders into the work. At Columbia, we found it so meaningful to we were in conversation with the vice president for housing and dining, who, Scott Wright didn't really think of himself. I think he wasn't even sure what he was doing on our institutional advisory board. But at some point we could see the light bulb go off when we were talking about students and how, as Marjorie was saying, they sort of get funneled back into rooms where there's a desk, a dresser, a desk chair, and a bed, which produces a sexual situation when one might not be intended. And he was like, oh yeah, I could do something about that. And so he made the decision to keep one of the cafeterias open all night. The one with like foosball tables and, you know, loungy armchairs and French fries. And the point is not that French fries are going to prevent all sexual assaults, but that is the level at which we should be thinking, at the environmental level. And so sexual projects certainly are part of it, but we think actually our power in prevention and what can be really transformational is bringing in people who have the power to allocate space, which is, you know, people who do prevention work that is not typically their institutional location in the university. So sexual projects, important. Sexual geographies, that's where we're going to get the most bang for our buck.
The book is Sexual Citizens. The authors are Jennifer Hirsch and Shamus Khan. On behalf of Elizabeth and myself and our entire team here at the SUNY Arrive Center, what a privilege to have you on. And we hope that everyone joins us in June and September as we continue this conversation, all available absolutely free, with the gratitude to Jennifer and Shamus for volunteering their time. Thank you to Margie for getting this all started and her commitment to really working this. And thank you to the hundreds of you who joined us for this incredible conversation. We will see you again on these webinars. And until then, we wish you all the best of good health. Thanks, everybody. Be well.